All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those words were written into America's founding document on the 4th of July 1776. They became the moral foundation of a new nation. And yet, for nearly a century after they were written, millions of human beings living inside that same nation were bought, sold, whipped, and shackled, denied every one of those rights the country claimed to hold sacred. That contradiction couldn't last forever. Eventually, it exploded into the bloodiest conflict in American history, a war that pitted brother against brother, tore a nation in two, and ultimately decided whether the words "all men are created equal" would mean something, or nothing at all. This is the story of the American Civil War. To understand why the Civil War happened, we have to go back to the earliest days of the Republic. When the United States won its independence from Britain in the late 1700s, it inherited far more than just territory. It inherited an entire economic system built by its former colonial rulers, one that depended heavily on enslaved labour. Over the following decades, that system became a defining feature of the American economy, particularly in the South. Millions of Africans had been forcibly taken from their homelands and transported to North America, where they were stripped of every basic human right and treated not as people, but as property bought, sold, and traded like livestock. Families were torn apart. Husbands separated from wives, children from parents, siblings scattered across different plantations, often never to see one another again. Enslaved people were forced to labour from before sunrise until well after dark, and those who resisted faced brutal punishment, whippings, shackles, branding, and worse. It was, without exaggeration, one of the greatest moral catastrophes in American history, and it built enormous wealth for the plantation class that depended on it. By the mid-1800s, the American economy had split into two fundamentally different systems. The northern states raced ahead with industrialization factories, railroads, and a free wage labour workforce that fueled a rapidly growing capitalist economy. The South, by contrast, remained anchored to an agricultural plantation economy, one utterly dependent on enslaved labour to remain profitable. This wasn't just an economic difference, it was a structural divide with no easy resolution. The North didn't need slavery. It needed free labourers to power its factories and expanding markets. The South's entire economic model, on the other hand, was built on the opposite premise. Early efforts at compromise between the two regions gained some ground. Abolitionist movements grew louder in the North, while in the South, the domestic slave trade only expanded further to meet the demands of ever larger plantations, turning human trafficking into one of the most profitable enterprises in the region. For a time, this uneasy balance held, largely because political power was split roughly evenly between the two sides. By 1837, the United States consisted of 26 states, 13 free states, and 13 slave states, giving neither side a decisive advantage in national politics. The country existed in a fragile equilibrium. That equilibrium couldn't last. As the nation's economy demanded room to grow, the United States pushed aggressively westward across the North American continent through land purchases from Britain, France, Spain, and Russia, through war with Mexico, and through a series of annexation treaties. This newly acquired territory was rich in natural resources and vast in scale, seen by many as the springboard for America's rise to greatness. And that made it something else entirely, a prize both North and South were determined to claim for themselves. Every time a new territory applied to join the Union, the same explosive question resurfaced: would it enter as a free state or a slave state? Each time, the delicate balance of power tipped a little further, and resentment between the regions climbed a little higher. There was more at stake than just politics. By the mid-19th century, the United States had built the fourth largest industrial economy in the world and had ambitions of overtaking Europe altogether. Achieving that meant developing a unified, coordinated capitalist economy across the entire country and the persistence of slavery in the South, with its outdated, inefficient labour system, stood as one of the biggest obstacles in the way. To make matters worse, Southern planters, determined to protect their way of life, worked to isolate their regional economy importing foreign goods while blocking Northern products from entering Southern markets. This wasn't just bad for Northern industrialists' bottom line. It actively damaged the national economy and deepened the wedge between the two halves of the country. When economic tension reaches a boiling point, what comes next is almost always political conflict. In 1854, a coalition of anti-slavery activists founded the Republican Party. It quickly won broad support among Northern business interests and rapidly grew into a genuine political counterweight to the pro-slavery Democratic Party. Over the following 6 years, the two parties clashed in increasingly bitter political warfare. Republicans argued that while the Founding Fathers may not have believed all people were equal in every respect, they held that everyone possessed certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness among them. Democratic politicians, particularly in the South, countered that black Americans weren't citizens at all, and therefore weren't entitled to any constitutional protections whatsoever. Republicans, in turn, accused their opponents of trying to rewrite the Constitution itself to further entrench the institution of slavery. In 1860, the United States held its 19th presidential election. Abraham Lincoln won without carrying a single slave state, propelled entirely by an overwhelming electoral majority from the free states. He became the 16th President of the United States. Lincoln despised slavery for its brutality, and for the economic and political turmoil it had caused. But he was also a shrewd, careful politician. He understood that any attempt to abolish the institution immediately and by decree would plunge the country into chaos. Instead, he tried to reassure Southern slaveholders that their property wouldn't be stripped from them overnight. It didn't matter. People whose interests feel threatened, even just the mere hint of a threat, tend to react with extraordinary hostility. To the Southern planter class, Lincoln's election felt like a gun pointed directly at everything they had built their world around. On the 20th of December 1860, South Carolina declared its secession from the United States. Within 2 months, 6 more Southern states followed. On the 4th of February 1861, these 7 states formed a new government, the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as its president. Naturally, the federal government in Washington refused to recognize this breakaway government as legitimate, treating secession as an act of outright treason. Once formed, the Confederacy began seizing federal property located within its borders. In mid-April 1861, Confederate forces attacked and captured Fort Sumter, a federal stronghold on the South Carolina coast. The American Civil War had officially begun. In response to the South's aggression, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteer soldiers to suppress what he considered a rebellion and preserve the unity of the federal government. That decision pushed 4 more states to secede and join the Confederacy, bringing its total military strength to roughly 100,000 men. Hoping for a swift resolution to the conflict, Union military leadership devised a strategic blueprint known as the Anaconda Plan. The plan called for a naval blockade sealing off the entire eastern and southern coastline of the Confederacy, cutting off supply and logistics routes by sea. Next, Union forces would seize control of the Mississippi River, splitting Confederate territory in 2. Finally, the core Union armies would launch a full-scale assault to capture the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, ending the war decisively. It didn't go according to plan. As Union forces marched toward Richmond, Confederate commanders received advance warning and prepared to meet them at Manassas, Virginia. There, on the 21st of July 1861, the first major battle of the Civil War unfolded what would become known as the First Battle of Bull Run. Roughly 70,000 soldiers on both sides collided in a scene of near-total chaos. Many of the men were green recruits with no real combat experience, and to make matters worse, the uniforms and flags of both armies looked confusingly similar, leading to friendly fire confusion on both sides. That summer, a Confederate general with a well-known fondness for whiskey Ulysses S. Grant, on the Union side, would eventually earn his own reputation on this front, scored several critical victories for the Union in the Western Theatre, giving the Federal cause some much-needed breathing room after the disaster at Bull Run. In March of the following year, Union forces launched what became known as the Peninsula Campaign, A plan to advance on Richmond from the southeast via the Virginia Peninsula, coordinated with a second push from the north to encircle the Confederate capital in a pincer movement. But the plan quickly fell apart. Confederate forces diverted north to strike in the Shenandoah Valley, tying down a large portion of Union troops and derailing the coordinated assault. Despite this, the southeastern advance on Richmond continued on its own. A month later, Confederate forces launched a surprise attack on a Union army near a small Tennessee river town called Shiloh. Despite their significant numerical advantage, Union forces suffered a humiliating defeat and were forced into a grueling retreat to safety. The victory cemented the reputation of Confederate General Robert E. Lee as a brilliant tactician, and Union morale sank to dangerous new lows. Then things nearly got worse. Watching the string of Union defeats unfold from across the Atlantic, Britain began to conclude the Union simply couldn't win, and started tilting toward recognising the Confederacy. Part of the motivation was economic. Southern cotton, a critical raw material for Europe's textile industry, had been unable to reach European markets for months due to the Union naval blockade. Britain wanted this war finished, one way or another, and fast. For Lincoln, preventing foreign intervention had become an urgent priority. Combined with growing pressure from abolitionist activists, he made a fateful decision. It was time to transform the character of the war itself, from a fight to preserve the Union into a war to abolish slavery altogether. But to make that declaration credible, Lincoln needed one thing first: a decisive military victory to stand on. That opportunity arrived under the worst possible circumstances. Buoyed by his recent battlefield successes, General Lee led over 50,000 Confederate troops across the border in an invasion of Union territory, hoping to force a negotiated peace and secure European recognition once and for all. Union forces discovered Lee's plans in advance and mobilized 87,000 troops to meet him along Antietam Creek in Maryland. In a single day of fighting, the 17th of September, 1862, approximately 23,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing. It remains the bloodiest single day in American military history. Despite suffering heavier losses, Union forces succeeded in pushing Confederate troops back into Virginia, protecting the heart of the country and crushing the Confederacy's hopes of winning European support. More than just a battlefield victory, Antietam gave Lincoln exactly the platform he needed. On the 1st of January 1863, he formally issued the Emancipation Proclamation, arguably the single most consequential document in American history since the nation's founding. From that moment forward, the character of the Civil War changed fundamentally. What had begun as a conflict over military strategy, economics, and the preservation of the Union had transformed into an uncompromising moral struggle between freedom and bondage, between civilization and barbarism. The war now carried a higher purpose, one that would, in a sense, cleanse the nation and give rise to a new America, one without the stain of slavery. The proclamation's impact reached far beyond the battlefield. It reframed the Union Army as a force fighting for freedom and justice, inspiring a surge of new enlistments, men who now saw themselves fighting not just for millions of enslaved people trapped in bondage in the South, but for the future of generations yet to come. It also effectively ended any remaining possibility of foreign intervention. No European power could credibly justify siding against a cause so clearly rooted in basic human decency and justice. By July 1863, General Lee decided to gamble everything on one final push. He led his army north in a full-scale invasion aimed at capturing Washington, D.C. outright and forcing an immediate Union surrender. Union forces intercepted them at the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg, setting off what would become the largest, bloodiest, and most famous battle of the entire war, and one of the most consequential in all of American history. If the South won here, Washington would very likely fall. If the North held, the momentum of the entire war could shift decisively. On July 1st, the two armies collided, and fighting erupted immediately. Confederate forces attacked aggressively, breaking through Union lines on the northern and western flanks, and forcing Federal troops to fall back to more defensible high ground. By the following day, both sides had brought the bulk of their forces to the field, spread across miles of battle line. Facing a Union defensive formation shaped like a fishhook, Lee seized the initiative, launching attacks against both Union flanks and very nearly breaking through the left side of the Federal line. But in a desperate moment, Union troops mounted a daring bayonet counterattack that drove the Confederates back. The Union line held, though, at a staggering cost. On the third and final day, believing both Union flanks had been sufficiently weakened by the previous day's fighting, Lee made his boldest and most fateful decision, an all-out assault on the centre of the Union line, hoping to break it once and for all. Union commanders anticipated the move and massed overwhelming concentrations of rifles and artillery, unleashing devastating firepower on the advancing Confederate ranks. The attack remembered to history as Pickett's charge was annihilated. With no viable options remaining, Lee's army was forced to retreat back into Southern territory. Just one day later, the 4th of July 1863, Independence Day itself, Union forces under General Grant captured Vicksburg after a grueling month-long siege, seizing one of the Confederacy's last major strongholds on the Mississippi River. Grant had originally planned to press further into Southern territory, forcing Lee's army to fall all the way back to Richmond and lay siege to the Confederate capital directly. Instead, Union forces pursued a different strategy surrounding key logistics hubs and severing the railroad supply lines that kept Richmond fed and armed. The twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the true turning point of the war. From this moment forward, the strategic initiative belonged decisively to the North. In 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman and his army captured Atlanta, one of the Confederacy's most vital cities. The victory reinforced growing Northern confidence that final triumph was now within reach, and it played a critical role in securing Lincoln's re-election to a second term as president that same year. In early 1865, after a long and fierce political battle waged by Lincoln and his allies, Congress finally passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, formally abolishing slavery throughout the United States. The amendment declared that no form of slavery or involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime would be permitted to exist anywhere within American territory or under American jurisdiction. It was a monumental political victory for the Union, arguably the single greatest achievement of the entire moral crusade to end slavery, and it had an immediate, powerful effect on the morale and fighting spirit of Union troops on the front lines. Bolstered both materially and spiritually, Union forces surged across every remaining front, crushing what little organised Confederate resistance remained. 1 month after the amendment's passage, on April 2nd, General Grant shattered the last Confederate defensive lines at Petersburg, forcing Lee to abandon Richmond entirely. The following day, the flag of the United States flew once again over the fallen Confederate capital. 1 week after that, the Confederacy's top military commander surrendered at a small village in Virginia. Although several scattered Confederate units hadn't yet formally laid down their arms, April 9th, 1865 is remembered as the day the 4-year war, one marked by staggering loss and devastation, effectively came to an end. The following day, a grand victory celebration was held in Washington, D.C., but the joy proved tragically short-lived. Just 4 days after that celebration, on the night of April 14th, President Abraham Lincoln was shot in the back of the head by John Wilkes Booth. He died the next morning, surrounded by his grieving wife and cabinet members. Lincoln became the first American president ever assassinated. For 3 weeks, a funeral train carried his body across cities throughout the North, where hundreds of thousands of mourners gathered to pay their respects to the fallen president. Countless others lined the railroad tracks as the train passed, lighting torches and bonfires in a final, silent tribute. The train's last stop was Springfield, Illinois, where Lincoln was laid to rest at Oak Ridge Cemetery. From that moment on, he belonged to history. It's a question worth sitting with, and reasonable people land in different places on it. What's not in dispute is the economic transformation that followed. In the decades after the war, the American economy underwent a dramatic shift. With a newly freed workforce now available, American industrial capitalism found the fuel it needed to expand at a staggering pace. Existing industries grew, and entirely new ones emerged, including oil refining, steel production, and electric power generation. The railroad network expanded dramatically, weaving every region of the country into a single, unified national market. By the 1920s, roughly 50 years after a war that had nearly torn the country apart, the United States had risen to become the #1 economic power on Earth, a position it would hold, by most measures, for the rest of the century and beyond. A war that began over economics, politics, and the survival of the Union ended up becoming something far larger, a referendum on whether America's founding promise of equality applied to everyone, or just to some. It cost more American lives than every other American war combined. It ended slavery, and it forced a fractured nation to begin, however imperfectly and however incompletely, the long work of living up to its own ideals. That work, as history would go on to show, was far from finished. But the Civil War proved something essential about the American experiment, that its founding words carried enough weight to be worth fighting and dying for. If you found this chapter of American history as gripping as we did, subscribe to Timeless Chronicles and tell us in the comments, which era should we explore next?